the extra mile and witness a journey of triumph and tragedy. Next on Chris Bonington, the Everest Years.
I think you should pack everything you possibly can into life, at whatever age you happen to be, whether you're 18, 35, 52 as I am now, or when you're 75. It's a matter really of developing yourself to the absolute potential, and I think the most important thing of all is not to let other people almost put constraints around you. I think I'm quite a young person, probably downright immature. And therefore, no, I'm going to just climb to the absolute full just for the sheer love of it. The reason why I went back to Everest for a fourth time was because I hadn't got actually up to the top of it. And I think it's something that must be kind of in every climber's kind of inner gut feeling, you know, that he wants to get to the top of the mountain. And so that when Annapurna really offered it to me on a silver platter, being a member of a large, well-organized expedition going by the South Col route, which is probably the easiest route, a big team of Sherpas, masses of oxygen. It's an invitation I couldn't resist. I cried and cried in great gasping sobs, tears of exhaustion, tears of sorrow for so many friends who'd died, and yet tears of fulfillment for something I'd so much needed to do. Then suddenly I was there. I had at last reached the summit of Everest. It was the 21st of April, 1985. I've never really thought of packing and climbing, and never would do, because I love climbing so much. But it's not just climbing, it's being in the mountains, it's being part of the mountains. And therefore, I've got to be realistic and realize that as I get older, my actual physical powers are going to deteriorate. I mean, amazingly, they don't seem to have deteriorated that much up to now. And I've got a feeling I've got quite a few more years of quite exciting climbing ahead of me. But, you know, even in a few years' time, when I can't do what I can do now, I don't think really matter to me. I'll always want to go into the mountains. I'll always enjoy being part of the mountains. I came up here as a young fantastic cadet and had the epic of all time.
Smith's route is probably technically the most difficult of the traditional grade 5 routes on Ben Nevis. And climbers of all ages are aspiring to routes like Smith's. It may have been passed in terms of the ultimate technical difficulty on Ben Nevis, but it's still a route that a great many ice climbers would like ultimately to climb.
Going climbing on the Ben is almost a transition between the smaller rock climbs of the summer and the giants of the Himalayas. You can almost feel you're in the Himalayas, certainly on a wild, windy day. And there's a feeling of real expedition in it. There's a feeling of adventure in it that perhaps missing when you're rock climbing in the summer on sun-warmed rock. I tend not to put in much protection. On this one I just put in one ice piton just below the really steep part. And then as you're running the rope out further, and you've got a feeling of tension, a little feeling of fear as well, and there's a slight crack around the ice. You wonder whether it's safe or not, a slight twinge of fear perhaps, and then you realise it's okay, you take a step up and you slowly work your way up until the end of the pitch, and suddenly you found a stance, you're safe. And then there's a huge sense of kind of light-headed, bubbling happiness, relief, and I find myself, I'm totally tuneless, but I just find myself singing silly songs, just out of sheer happiness of being there, having done a good pitch, as, in this case, Jim wanders up behind me.
He's a very good climber, and it doesn't matter whether it's rock climbing in the Lake District or ice climbing on Ben Nevis. It's all the same to him. It's just a fun thing to be doing. And I would imagine he's climbing now. He's certainly climbing more and harder ice routes now than he was in his 20s and 30s.
Before moving into Badger Hill, I never thought the houses were really important, but since moving here, I've come to love both this place and its environment, and somehow it's come to symbolize, I think, the whole value of our standard of life. I mean, my love for Wendy, my love for the children, and this is the rock-solid base. This is the place where it's an absolute joy to come back to from all my adventures.
I'm just wondering if we can't do something with that. It's so simple. It'd be really good for graphics. What I like to do is to work quite closely on the visual production of his books and to make audiovisual pieces which will go into his lectures. He's a wonderful, enthusiastic speaker, but these can just put a bit extra on and create extra atmosphere. Well, I don't know. This is just...
My memories of Sandhurst, actually on the whole, were good ones. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's amazing that there's the young, clean-shaven Bonington in his junior year, and then I rose to, I did well at Sandhurst. I actually became an under-officer. You can see me there with me sword standing out in front, very clean cut. I actually passed out 19th from Sandhurst to go into the Royal Tank Regiment. Got a lot of good climbing then as well. A lot of these pictures, actually, it's only when I started having pictures taken of me were round about then. I suppose that's one of the earliest ones. Now, these are some pictures, once again, from the southwest. My first ever brush, I suppose, with media climbing. That's the great big wall in the Cheddar Gorge, and it was unclimbed in 1965. And the opportunity came when a producer from TWW, which was the TV station in the Midwest, in fact, approached me and said they wanted to do this outdoor broadcast. So it had to be somewhere in the Bristol area. And I immediately thought of the Cheddar Gorge as by far the most dramatic place. And it was very, very steep climbing indeed. There was this huge shield of rock that seemed to be just stuck onto the wall, and it was gently overhanging. And the thought of actually clinging onto it, and then the whole lot coming away with oneself clinging to this 20 tons of rock, was just too frightening. And so I put in a piton to one side and stood in a sling and kind of teetered round and managed to get round it. Though since, of course, it's been climbed free. I think even to this day, actually, is the most beautiful route that I've ever made a first descent of, certainly in this country.
Challenge will return in a moment.
Hi, I'm Kirk Muller. If you don't have Sports Channel, then you're missing the big game, like the red hot
Himalayan face, almost the Himalayan equivalent of the North Wall of the Eiger, to actually be attempted. When we chose the south face of Annapurna, I don't think we really remotely knew what we were getting into. And of course, for me, it was a huge step in that I'd never ever led an expedition before. We had a small group of climbers who were going for something that was totally new. And not only that, though we were a very strong team, I mean, we were probably the strongest team technically that Britain had ever put together to go to the Himalayas, we were actually thin on actual Himalayan experience.
I think if there was a casualty at all, it would be a question of withdrawing altogether. We all do know each other very well, and it'd be more than just, a soldier being shot next to you on the battlefield sort of thing.
It ended up with Don Willans and Dougal Haston out in front together, and they were the two that I had the most confidence in. They had a terrific combined drive when they were out in front, and they were the only two that I felt totally relaxed, knowing that they would be pushing things out as hard as they possibly could. And so it ended up with just Ian Clough and myself actually supporting Don and Dougal. So somehow that teetering scaffolding of support managed to last until, in a minimal break in the weather, Don and Dougal went for it.
The British Annapurna South Face expedition reached the summit of Annapurna 1 on 27th of May. I say again, figures 27 May at 14:30 hours local time. Stop. The summit pair were Don Willans and Dougal Haston.
I should just like to say a very few words about Ian. He was a fine mountaineer, a very, very safe one. But most important of all, he was the kindest, he was the most unselfish, and I think the most universally liked person that I've ever known.
The southwest face of Everest was the obvious thing to go for after the south face of Annapurna, the hardest way up the highest mountain on Earth. There'd already been 3 expeditions that had tried and failed, and somehow I felt that everything I'd learned on the south face of Annapurna about leadership organisation should be put into practice on the southwest face of Everest. In the event, we were slightly too late in starting. We actually established base camp in mid-September. We moved slightly too slowly, and this meant we were engulfed by the winter winds, and that's what really defeated us. You'd hear this roar, 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 then crash, and that was the wind hitting the southwest face. And then it had come tearing down the great central gully up which we were going. And it was once again like the train, roaring down, and then it had hit the tents, and it was almost like a solid force, and you just wondered, could even these box tents actually survive? And, in fact, they didn't always survive. They were just ripped to bits. It became, through October, right into November, just a battle of attrition, temperatures getting down to -40, and I mean, what the wind chill factors of that was, I just don't know.
Even when you just got outside the tent for a few minutes, it takes about 10 minutes over a primer stove to try to thaw out your feet. How easy it is to get frostbite was shown by Nick Escort and Dave Marthgate. To get good radio communications, it's essential to cook the batteries before about 10 minutes before the radio schedule. Otherwise, you just don't get communications at all. The batteries won't work.
And somehow we kept going. We slowly pushed the route out until we were at the foot of the rock band. You had to get to the foot of the rock band in a really strong kind of state. It was no good at all, as all the previous expeditions had done, arriving at the foot of the rock band, really in the last stages of exhaustion. I think really we could have only climbed it if it had been just an easy kind of wander to the top, which of course it wasn't. We were actually approaching the most difficult part of the entire climb. Wendy and I have now been married for very nearly 25 years, and I think throughout that time, I think our love actually has got stronger and stronger. She's my absolute solid foundation, and there's no doubt about it, I don't think I could have done a fraction of what I've done without that loving support. I think the toughest thing in being married to me for her has been when accidents have occurred on my expedition. Wendy has filled really the pivotal role in organising the breaking of the news to the next of kin. And it's something that she's always done with extraordinary compassion.
I hadn't had anything to do with climbers or mountaineers at all before I met Chris. And I wasn't really interested. In fact, in the early days, I was definitely a bit turned off by the obsessive quality I found in a lot of climbers. Once they got together, it was all this totally obsessive climbing talk. But I liked the other things that climbing brought with it, you know, the trips up to Wales and the camping, outdoor life, if you like, and friendships that you made, wives and girlfriends.
Brahma, I think, was one of the best trips I've ever had. We went for this really lovely 20,000-foot summit. It was in 1973, just after we'd failed on the southwest face of Everest. And it provided a wonderful contrast. There were just two of us, Nick Escort and myself. The climb turned out to be challenging and committing, but it was also a tremendous amount of fun. And I mean, ironically, I think the kind of expedition that I enjoy most of all is the very, very small expedition. I enjoy the two-man expedition. I mean, decision-making is so much simpler when it's just two of you. When we got to the summit, it was a really terrific feeling. And quite incredibly beautiful. And I think the fact that we were such a small team made it even better. I definitely wanted to go back to Everest, and it was in the summer of 1974 that we learnt that the Canadians who had the booking for autumn 1975 had cancelled, and that's when we decided to go back for the southwest face. When you actually get to the start of the expedition, one of your big problems is that initially there isn't enough for people to do, you know, on the approach march, or even in the early stages of the expedition. I've always believed in effective delegation in running expeditions, and I think I'm actually good at it. One of the problems there is you can only delegate to a certain number of people, and for instance, when you are organising the expedition, you need about 3 people to actually do various jobs. And therefore, it's inevitable that the people who haven't actually got a direct job to do start feeling slightly restless. They've got nothing to do, they're bored, therefore they start thinking of things to grumble about.
He's very much the leader. However much you might say he's coordinator, he is the leader. Before I got some definite role to play, and I think it must go for a lot of the other lads, you felt, or I felt, that there was this, the leadership, and then there were the rest of us that were being sort of ordered about. and I wasn't always in complete sympathy with the leadership. But as soon as we had a role to play, it was fine. I felt much closer to things. There was something to go for.
This time, we arrived at the foot of the rock band with the team in strong enough condition to have a chance of climbing it. It was Nick Escort and Tut Braithwaite who finally solved the problem of the rock band, which allowed Doug Scott and Dougal Haston to make the first summit bid.
Hello, Doug. It's great to hear you. Did you make it? Over. Wonderful, Doug. Congratulations from every single one of us. How are you? How are you? Over. Roger, okay. Do you think you've got any frostbite? Over. No, I don't think so. We had a very miserable bivouac outside last night. Why not put a brew on now, get yourselves warmed up. We're listening out the whole time, so as soon as you've got yourself sorted out, you can come back to us. But meanwhile, congratulations from every single one of us. Well done.
Once you've made that first attempt, and if it's been successful, and of course it was, Doug and Dougal got to the top of the mountain. And I must say, I as leader at that point, especially I suppose as I'd already stood down from either of the second or third attempts, I would have loved to have actually been able to declare the expedition over, and we could have gone home, safe expedition, we've been successful and everything else. But I think it would have been morally wrong to have done that, and certainly would have been unacceptable to the rest of the team. I had to give them the chances of going for the summit, so that when they actually moved up for their second attempt and moved up to Camp 6, Mick was actually a long, long way behind Pete, Martin and Patemba, who were the other three members of that team. Peter Boardman and the Sherpa Patemba reached the summit at 1:10 p.m. on the 26th of September. They quickly decided to retreat down the mountain as the weather began to deteriorate. 100 metres below the summit, they met Mick Berg going for the top on his own. Pete and Patemba waited for him for over an hour and a half in the teeth of a terrible storm.
We could see about 5 feet at this time. The snow was icing up our eyes, and we just felt we had to go. We just couldn't wait any longer, because with the weather being as it was, we'd have never survived a night out there.
Eventually I heard a sort of crunch in the snow, and I popped my head out of the tent, and I saw Pete sort of really quite sort of staggering in with his face. Obviously, it wasn't a sort of jubilant face. It was a face of, you know, horror, really. And I immediately asked, you know, how many of there are you? And he said, there's myself and Petey. I said, where's Mick? He said, oh, God knows, God knows.
I'm absolutely certain that Mick actually reached the summit, and I think even more so, having actually been there and trod those steps myself, because having passed the place where Pete and Patemba saw Mick for the last time, it's just an easy walk. It's literally a walk to the summit with a height gain of about 100 feet. And my guess is what happened, and this, of course, is the guess that Pete had when he was in this, totally ghastly position of sitting there on the south summit, on the corridors below the south summit, waiting for Mick to arrive, and he didn't come. But there's a huge cornice on the Tibetan side. And what happened was that about 20 minutes after they parted, the weather suddenly deteriorated from just being cloudy into a full-blown storm. It was a whiteout, and in those conditions you've got driving snow. Of course, it doesn't help that Mick wore glasses and is blind as a bat without them. Even wearing goggles, the snow gets in behind your goggles, it gets into absolutely everything. You can't see where you're going. In a whiteout, the line of the cornice would just blur with the driving snow. And it would have been so desperately easy to walk straight through that cornice.
challenge will return after these messages.
Oops. I'm a bit greasy today.
I suppose the one problem is just avoiding dysentery, isn't it?
Yeah, especially in parking.
For 77, I booked the Ogre in the Karakoram. There was Clive Rowland and myself in at the start, and then we decided to ask Paul Braithwaite and Mo Antoine. And then I thought, well, perhaps Chris would like to come on that trip. And I really had, at that time, I was feeling very grateful for Chris for doing all the work on organising 2 Everest trips that I'd been on with him. And thought he'd perhaps find it interesting to come on a trip which was quite different from those big ones.
In fact, Doug's little trip ended up with us both having the worst ordeal we'd ever had on a mountain. It was getting very late when Doug reached the summit, and by the time I got there, he was ready to abseil back down. And I was just admiring that breathtakingly beautiful view when the absolute silence was shattered by this gargling scream from below, and I immediately thought, he's gone off the end of the rope.
And I was just out of gear, you know, I was too impatient. Suddenly all these rocks were rushing towards me, and I managed to get my feet up in front of me, like a pair of buffers, to take the impact, and splat straight into it.
Doug had broken both his legs, and we were now in a desperate position. We bivouacked without any gear at all before reaching Mern Clive, and were then marooned in our snow cave for 4 days by a savage storm. But eventually we knew that we had to go down or perish.
And then the day after that, 4 days after the accident, Chris was coming down last man on the double abseil rope, but unfortunately they were unevenly matched, and he went off the 2 ropes onto the 1, so the ropes pulled through rapidly, and as Chris shot down 20 or 30 feet and smashed his ribs and his arm, his hand on a rock sticking out, bashed his head as well. And from then on, I'm sure he was in much more pain than I was.
By now I was getting desperately worried. There was no way that we could carry Doug. He had to crawl down the mountain on his hands and knees, and I felt that if the storm didn't end soon, I'd probably kick the bucket myself.
But just as we were beginning to sort of despair, and certainly Chris at that point, the good weather came back, clouds pulled away and clear blue skies, and we were able to get ourselves down to the big plateau.
After we'd climbed the southwest face of Everest in 1975, I think we were all looking around for other challenges, other objectives to go for. And I decided on K2, second highest mountain in the world.
Well, I was just looking forward to getting to Camp 2, 30 feet to go. I was having a last rest, gasping away for air, and suddenly there was a tremor, went through the snow underneath me, and almost straight after there was another one, and by this time the adrenaline was surging through my body, and I realised that there was going to be something nasty happening. And I dived onto my ice axe, pressed it into the snow as a kind of belay, and I looked back across my tracks and realised that the whole of the snow slope was sliding off.
The whole slope just began to move. It was absolutely enormous. It was so big that I couldn't believe it. It was like watching a film. And the figure in the middle was just completely overwhelmed by this avalanche. He moved down with the slope seemed to be moving down with him, and then he just disappeared.
Suddenly, I found myself stopped dead in the snow. I'd gone right over it on a complete somersault, and with 65 pounds on my back, I'd made like a giant anchor in the snow. And with that stop, the rope snapped, and I found myself right on the edge of the avalanche. I rubbed myself down, looked round for Nick, but he'd gone down some 5,000 foot of ice cliff and steep rock, yelling his name, but nothing to do but just to go up to Camp 2.
And then Doug's voice came up. And Doug, his voice was breaking, he was obviously in tears, and said that Nick had been caught in an avalanche, and in fact had been in that avalanche that had come pouring down. Of all the friends I've lost in the mountains, I think there's no doubt about it that the loss of Nick had the greatest effect on me. He was my closest friend, probably. And, I mean, the effect was so great that I didn't think I'd go to the Himalayas again, and it was a full 2 years before I even contemplated going back to the Himalayas. The family side of my life is incredibly important to me, and I suppose it acts as a foil to my climbing. Daniel's 20, he's a wonderful, happy extrovert. He quite enjoys climbing, but I don't think he's completely taken with it.
Strangely enough, the best times that we've ever had have been when we've actually been on climbing weekends together. Once was to Arran. We just spent just a weekend together, me and my dad, and we just had a brilliant time. Did some easy climbs, you know. As far as Mum's concerned, she does get very, very upset, but I don't think she really shows it that much to Dad. But I mean, when he's actually gone, you know, it's like quite disturbing to see how Mum's going or how Mum's coping. It's amazing how she does cope, and she's very strong, emotionally strong. But even then, I mean, there's times when, you know, you can only take so much. He wouldn't be where he is now without my mum.
Rupert's my younger son. He's a good natural ball player and he's great at pool. He's a much more private person than Daniel, and yet he's also a very warm person.
When I was about 5 or 6, I first realised that it was starting to go away, because I'd like miss things like birthdays. Well, I guess on average, you must be away for at least 6 months a year. And, well, we'd all like to see him more. The thing is, when he gets back, he's immediately either off climbing or he's off working, and you can't disturb him when he's working. And if you try and go climbing with him, it's a failure, because I'm a bit scared of heights. Well, we're very similar in some ways, but when he's got a point of view, he won't change his mind. He's stubborn, very stubborn.
The Kongur trip was significant because it was one of the first mountaineering expeditions to be allowed into China since the communist takeover. And it also paved the way for me to attempt to climb the northeast ridge of Everest in 1982. Mount Kongur is 7,719 meters high, and it presented an attractive challenge to our lightweight climbing team, Joe Tasker, Peter Boardman, Alan Rouse, and myself. After being stormed off the mountain and retreating, all 4 of us eventually made another summit bid.
Al had led a pitch, I led another one. I had to sort of shout for mercy. I said, can we stop for a while, because I just got to warm my hands up.
So I led on through up difficult, steep terrain, and then Joe and Chris took over and led on to regain the main ridge.
I got around the corner onto a slope. I realised that we'd cracked this sort of first 500 foot, which was the main area of difficulty, and then we were on mixed ground, leading upwards in steps towards the summit.
The rest of the afternoon seemed to merge together into sort of one long stumble upwards. It was getting late in the afternoon as we suddenly started realising that, well, there was not much that could stop us now.
And here it began to open out, always getting closer to the summit, knowing that there was a very good chance that today we were going to reach the top.
across easy snow slopes was the summit, or what we hoped would be the summit, because in mountaineering you never actually know which will finally be the summit. The climb had been a lot harder than we'd anticipated, and we were all hoping on the easy summit slopes that there weren't going to be any final stings in the tail.
I'd never taken a flag to the top of a mountain before, but somehow I was really enthused about stringing these 3 flags together because, well, this was one of the highest unclimbed mountains in the world. We were the first to climb it. There didn't seem to be any reason why we shouldn't wave them around a bit.
And then as we got to the summit, we lined up the 3 of us, and then Joe was absolutely determined to be in the picture as well himself.
I thought it's a bit daft if there's only 3 people seen in the summit. So I then rushed into the picture and stood there, so I was in the summit photo too.
And I remember having a feeling of just absolute kind of incredible bubbling joy. The other thing, of course, about the Kongur expedition was that it really opened the way for the Everest expedition. We'd actually gone to China, of course, the previous year in 1980 to make a reconnaissance and negotiate with the Chinese. And it was during that time that I just couldn't resist, really, the temptation to go for the north side of Everest.
Challenge turn after these messages.
Getting to the top of the mountain that intrigued me and what got me onto the Everest expedition. I wanted to climb, I suppose, go on climbing with the very, very best climbers and people whom I really enjoyed climbing with. I wanted to climb with Pete and Joe and then with Dick Renshaw. But I then, of course, was climbing with people who were completely committed to an alpine-style push, a small expedition push without using oxygen. I mean, realistically, I should have said, there's no way I was going to get to the top of Everest by a very, very difficult route without using oxygen. Pete and Joe actually set out from our advanced base camp on the 15th of May of '82. They did it in 2 days up to our top camp, which had normally always before that taken 3 days. So they were going really well, really strongly. We actually saw them for the last time on the 17th of May, and we'd watched them the whole day, and they moved desperately slowly that day. They set out from their camp. It must have been actually before dawn, because we only picked them out at 9 o'clock that morning when there'd been about 2 hours of daylight. And they were already at their high point, so it meant that in 2 hours they'd climbed about 1,200 feet and they'd covered a lot of ground. And then it took them the whole of the rest of the day to make a height gain of, what, another 200, maybe 300 feet, and about 3 rope lengths. Now, that wasn't just altitude, that was technically difficult ground. It must have been. And of course, when we last saw them that evening, it meant they'd had a long, long day at above 27,000 feet above sea level. They maybe had an uncomfortable bivouac. I suppose that's something we'll never ever know. Anyway, the next day they had to go on after all of that. That was the day that we moved up to the North Col. And we spent the next 3 days gazing up, expecting them to come into sight on the other side of this second pinnacle. It was incredibly painful going through a slow transition of doubt about whether Pete and Joe were alive or not. And of course, throughout that period, part of you kind of hoped that they were still alive. And so right the way through, even though your logic told you that they must be dead, one's basic gut kind of says, but perhaps they are okay. And for instance, when we'd gone round the other side of the mountain, we went a long truck journey round the Carter Valley, and we walked right up the Kanchung Valley, then came and gazed up at the face from the Kanchung side, and of course saw absolutely nothing at all. And that confirmed that, they must have been dead.
When there is a, accident or something like that, there's a lot of general pressure and activities, sorting all that out. It's not a pleasant position to be in.
The biggest scar in the terms of personal loss, I mean, without a shadow of doubt, and it's a scar that I'll never ever get over. And that is, I mean, you know, the loss of my son. And that is something that I suppose enables me to understand what people like Hilary, Maria, Dorothy Boardman, Betty and Tom Tasker actually go through in losing their very nearest. And there's a difference between the deep, deep love you have for the woman in your life, or if it's the woman, the man in her life, or a child, to the friendship with your fellow climbers. That's a strong friendship. I mean, I deeply and strongly miss all those friends, be they Ian, Nick, Mick Burke, Joe or Pete, and so on. But the strength of that missing is just absolutely nothing, not remotely anything, to the cruelty of grief of losing someone, of the closeness of a child, of your immediate spouse.
Obviously, one doesn't like him. I mean, you don't get married to someone to sort of spend vast amounts of time apart, and especially with him doing things which could be dangerous. But on the other hand, that's part of the person he is, and therefore you can't throw that bit out of it. You've got to accept that bit and go along with it. And therefore I don't I try not to dwell on sort of being unhappy about that part. But obviously I miss him when he's away, but on the other hand, I can often get down to things which I don't necessarily get around to doing when he's away. And it each gives us a chance to develop, gives us each our own space to grow, and then we sort of, you know, come back together again. In a way, I think it helps for quite a healthy relationship in that way, that we do have time to develop and we respect each other's development. I think that's important. And then when we get together, we can each bring something new to the relationship.
There's certainly nothing that had actually stopped me climbing, as far as I know at the moment. Of course, you can never tell. But I am, I suppose, aware that I'm not going to be able to go on climbing at the same level that I'm climbing at you know, at the moment, forever. And therefore, I suppose that in the next few years, the level at which I'm climbing is going to settle down. I'm going to have to climb smaller peaks as I get older. But I hope I'll be able to go on climbing to various degrees for many, many years. You know, I like the thought of myself at the age of 80, wandering very gently up kind of the valleys of the Himalayas.
He loves climbing. It's very, very simple. There's a very straightforward enthusiasm for climbing in the hills. I love that enthusiasm in him. But I haven't a clue about any subtle motivation.